Within the 20th century, China had many possible destinies. This video will be part 1 in a series covering all of these possible fates, what led to their failure, and how they could have succeeded. This part will cover the late Qing Dynasty, which marched into the 20th century unprepared and abused by foreign powers, and would cement itself as the bookend of China's more than 2,000 years of imperial rule. Despite its weakened state, Qing China was still a nation of immense potential. I have once again attempted to sort it into 5 chapters covering the key points. I hope you enjoy. The Qing Dynasty was founded by the Manchu peoples of northern China. These people were distinct from other Chinese populations in language, history, and culture. They gained power through a series of military conflicts with the weakened Ming Dynasty, which had preceded them. During these conflicts, they forged alliances with select Mongol and Chinese factions that had their own grievances with the Ming government. Thus, they conquered China in 1644. However, they did not uproot the government in its entirety. Rather, they modified it to incorporate Manchu aspects and installed Manchu rulers. The early Qing dynasty would face many issues like economic instability, leading to a rough start for the new imperial court. But during the late 1600s and the entirety of the 18th century, from 1683 to 1799, the Qing would enter into their golden age under 3 emperors. The Kangxi Emperor from 1661 to 1722, the Yongzheng Emperor from 1722 to 1735, and the Qianlong Emperor from 1735 to 1799. These 3 emperors would bring vast territorial expansion, nearly doubling the size of the previous Ming territory, followed by economic growth and prosperity, as well as a cultural and artistic boom in fine arts like porcelain, literature, and philosophical debates. Therefore, Qing China would become a robust presence in Asia, and its future looked bright and full of opportunity. Unfortunately for the Qing government, history would not play out in their favor. After this century of prosperity and growth, the dynasty would enter into the century of humiliation. The 1800s became a thorn in the side of the Qing, as they became one of the centers of the imperialist ambitions of Russia, Japan, France, Britain, Germany, and occasionally the United States. This would see the loss of vast amounts of territory, as well as the leasing of port cities or treaty ports to Britain, Germany, Russia, and France. Britain would gain Hong Kong after the Opium Wars with China. These wars erupted over China's attempt to stop the illegal trade of opium into China from foreign lands. The trade started as a plan for Britain to find a loophole in Chinese trade. This is because whilst Britain bought vast amounts of tea, silk, and porcelain from China, the Chinese only accepted silver as payment. This drained British silver reserves. Therefore, Britain began smuggling opium grown in India into China for silver to buy more Chinese goods. The resulting widespread opium addiction across China caused social and economic harm, resulting in the Qing government banning the drug and destroying large shipments of it being smuggled into the nation. The first of these wars raged from 1839 to 1842 between the British Empire and the Qing after Chinese forces had seized illegal opium stocks. The British would decimate the Qing Navy during the First Opium War, as China utilized traditional wooden junks, whilst Britain employed large warships and steel steam-powered vessels. Ultimately, the First Opium War would go to Britain, in which they would claim Hong Kong Island and force China to open trade ports. The Qing would only get 14 years of peace before the Second Opium War erupted, this time with France joining Britain. The Second War lasted from 1856 to 1860, further damaging the Chinese military. The result of this war would be the forced legalization of opium in China and further territorial concession. This humiliation of China would result in numerous outside powers forcing them into unequal treaties. These were severely restrictive of the Qing government, weakening its authority in their own country. Within the First Opium War alone, China would be forced to open 5 treaty ports to British trade and residence: Guangzhou, Shanghai, Jianmen, Ningbo, and Fuzhou. As the century progressed, the number of ports would grow substantially to roughly 80. Certain cities would even be under specific European municipal control, such as Tianjin, which had areas run by Britain, France, Germany, and Russia. By 1898, some of these ports would be leased for absurd amounts of time. Germany would lease Kiaoqiao Bay and Qingdao for 99 years. Russia would take Dalian and Port Arthur for 25 years. Britain would take Weihaiwei as long as Russia held Port Arthur, and territories adjacent to Hong Kong for 99 years. France would take Guangzhou for 99 years to support their efforts in French Indochina. However, it is important to note that Portuguese Macau and the British island of Hong Kong were ceded in perpetuity rather than held on temporary leases. On top of all of this, the Qing Dynasty would face 2 rebellions and 1 revolution. The first of which is the Taiping Rebellion, led by Hong Jiquan, who thought he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This rebellion waged for 14 years, developing into a Civil War-level conflict from 1850 to 1864, which means they were fighting this war and the Second Opium War at the same time. Luckily, Qing forces would be able to capture the rebel capital of Nanjing after a long siege ending the war. The dynasty would maintain shaky control over China after such a destructive set of wars, only to be followed by the First Sino-Japanese War from 1894 to 1895, over influence in Korea. Japan's far more modernized military easily won the conflict, taking Korean influence and Taiwan as spoils of war. However, only 40 years later, in 1899, the Boxer Rebellion would break out. This rebellion sought to rid China of all foreign and Christian presence. This resulted in the creation of the 8-Nation Alliance, consisting of Germany, Russia, Japan, France, Britain, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the United States. These nations would send relief forces to aid their delegation troops in the capital, which the Boxers sought to kill. This event would be known as the 55 Days at Peking. Ultimately, the Boxers would not stand a chance against such a massive force, ending the rebellion in 1901. It's ironic how this alliance would meet one another on the field of war only 13 years later. The Qing Dynasty would only live to see 10 more years until the Xinhai Revolution of 1911. This revolution sparked out of the Qing court's inability to reform at a quick enough pace to save its collapsing empire, the severe debt and loss to foreign powers, and the railway crisis, where the Qing government sought to hand over local railways to foreign banks. The revolution would not last a year, beginning in October of 1911 and ending in February of 1912. This spelt the bitter end of the Qing Dynasty, giving rise to the brittle 1911 Republic of China, pioneered by Sun Yat-sen and concluding China's 2,000 years of imperial rule. But could this ultimate collapse have been avoided? Realistically, could the Qing court have reformed fast enough from 1900 before their collapse in 1911? Well, it's not entirely off the table, though it would not be an easy task by any means. Whilst the China that entered the 20th century had many issues, such as questionable legitimacy, the economy being strained, political instability, and a humiliated military, they still had a few stable foundations to build off of. These included their functioning bureaucracy, loyal provinces, a population that generally preferred stability, and even some foreign powers willing to assist in reform, such as Britain, Germany, and the United States, as well as the newly established Beiyang army. This would be just enough to sustain reforms. However, certain reforms would have had to have been essentially immediate rather than the slow 9-year plan the Qing court attempted. The Qing dynasty would have had to abolish the banner system, creating a unified national army, established a functional national parliament by latest 1905, and modernized the tax system by replacing grain taxes, land quotas, and corrupt local levies with a standardized national taxation, modern accounting, and foreign advisors. China would also have to kickstart an industrial drive, channeling a similar pace to the Meiji Restoration in Japan, only on a much larger scale, as Qing China needed more railways, modern arsenals, and a telegraph network, as well as modern ports and secure foreign investment. Education would also have to be reformed, abolishing the old exam system by 1905 or 1906, and rapidly replacing it with modern schools, technical colleges, and modern military academies. This would only be step one, with the next step being crucial. This being the neutralization of Yuan Shikai. The Qing government would have had to promote multiple generals, decentralize military command, and prevent Yuan Shikai from seizing control of the entire Beiyang army, and integrate provincial armies into a national structure. On this note, the military of China would have had to reformed by latest 1910. This would require the Qing government to establish 30 to 40 new divisions, standardize training, and recruit foreign advisors, likely from Germany, and obtain modern artillery and rifles. This would have had to be followed by the creation of a national general staff. Then, most importantly, the Beiyang Navy would have had to be almost entirely reconstructed and modernized simultaneously, using British shipyards, foreign naval advisors, and modern cruisers and destroyers would need to be constructed. Lastly, the Qing court would have to rework a vast amount of its foreign policy. They would have to utilize Britain's desire for stability and Japan's desire for influence to move into a closer position to the two powers to prevent being shoved around. Next, they would have to play nice with Russia and Japan and Manchuria until enough strength accumulated to renegotiate a more equal treaty. Lastly, they would have to gain investment and support from foreign powers to fund such reforms, likely pitting them against each other, as Japan did during the Meiji years, to buy time. This would be a daunting task, but should it have succeeded, the rewards would be worth the risk. Assuming that by some miracle, the Qing court is able to achieve all of these necessary reforms by 1911 or early 1912, China would look very different from its 19th century existence. It's likely that Qing China would transition into a constitutional monarchy by late 1915, after the national parliament proves capable of governing the nation. It would have a functional, unified national army, a steady process of industrialization. Yuan Shikai would have been neutralized or returned to exile, as well as an operational layered government. This government would include the National Assembly, a bicameral parliament, the cabinet, which would hold the executive power, and provincial governments like governors, mayors, and etc. New railways would be opening, allowing trade and transport to improve. A national bank of China would be established, and China would have vital heavy industry in coal, steel, and shipyards. It's possible that China could use this new stability and strength to renegotiate some of the unequal treaties to have mutual beneficial terms. China would also be able to proctor its own trade deals with other nations outside of the European nations that kept it contained, allowing for more prosperous deals. The Beiyang Navy would also be more on par with its competing nations, having moved on from wooden junks to modern steel destroyers and cruisers. All of this would bring the Qing Dynasty into essentially another golden age. Qing China would stabilize just as World War I would break out. This would likely lead to them joining on the side of the Allies, albeit a late entry. This would occur simply so China could reclaim the German leased city of Qingdao, and Japan and China being on the same side, as well as China's modernized military, would force Japan to halt any ambitions of expansion into China, allowing China to keep Qingdao. Its participation in World War I could also be used to bolster its reputation with other powers within the Allies, like Britain, France, and the United States, and Portugal because of Macau. This new influence and reputation would also be used to renegotiate unfair treaties if previous attempts early on had failed. Success would be more likely as China would have proven itself capable of self-defense and internal governance. The Great Depression would still hit China hard. However, the National Bank would make it more navigable than the many warring states of our timeline. By the late 1930s, as the world emerged from the Great Depression, China would see an economic boom, essentially turning the early 1940s into its Meiji era. Industrial centers like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Manchuria would experience immense growth during this time. Social reforms would also begin to make their way into the new Qing China, such as an expansion of women's education, foot binding being removed from practice, newspapers, flourishing universities, and thriving political clubs. This era would also give rise to a large Chinese middle class. The Qing Dynasty would also experience a renaissance in art, cinema, literature, and Neo-Confucianism. This unified, stable China would gravely hinder Imperial Japan's expansionist ideas in China, forcing them to dedicate more forces to Manchuria and China's coastline. This would push China to join the Allies in World War II, aiding the United States in the Pacific theater. Japan would likely have capitulated sooner due to the economic and military costs during a longer and larger land war in China, against a more experienced army, perhaps avoiding the dropping of the atomic bombs. But it would likely still prove difficult to push Japan out of China and its conquered lands in the Pacific swiftly, so it meeting the same end as it did in our timeline is still likely. This would result in China possibly aiding in the occupation of Japan and Korea, preventing Soviet interference. The Korean War would likely vanish from history as a strong, stable China would block Soviet resources, their easy access to Korea, and likely would have filled the Soviet Union's role in the Korean occupation, leading to a free United Korean Republic or a restored constitutional monarchy. After the Second World War, China would aid in rebuilding Asia like the United States did in Europe, cementing itself as a major power both globally and regionally. This refurbished, industrialized China would enter global affairs much earlier than in our timeline, and avoid the devastating warlord era, playing a role in both World Wars and the Cold War. This China would likely join the Western Bloc against communism, which has massive repercussions for the spread of communism. It's possible it even alters the outcome of the Vietnam War, making it difficult for the Soviet Union to get supplies to the north and depriving North Vietnam from Chinese supplies and troops, possibly leading to its internal collapse sooner if China launched another front against the north. Eventually, it would be assumed that China would form its own version of NATO, with Japan, Korea, and the Philippines. Ultimately, Qing China had a vast amount of untouched potential had it not been plagued by external interference and corruption. Thanks for watching, and stick around for part 2 of this series, covering Sun Yat-sen's Republic.